Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're excited to share with you that we have 2 upcoming Level 2 NARM therapist trainings beginning in May and in June. If you're a licensed mental health practitioner, we invite you to join us for either of these NARM therapist trainings. One training will take place in Austin, Texas, and the other training will take place live and online. This Level 2 training is designed to support mental health professionals who work with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Being trained in NARM, one of the first clinical models specifically designed to address ACEs and CPTSD, supports therapists to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're interested in this training, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information about both upcoming trainings, please visit narmtraining.com/level 2. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. And now for our interview. Bayo Akomolafe was first trained as a clinical psychologist. These days, he identifies more as an author, professor, researcher, and a proud diaper changer. He is recognized worldwide for his thoughtful and unconventional take on global crisis, social change, and trauma. Bayo considers his most sacred work to be learning how to be with his daughter and son, Alethea Anaya and Kaya Jaden, and their mother, his wife and life nectar, Ijeoma. Please enjoy this conversation with Bayo Akomolafe. We are here with Bayo Akomolafe. Hello, Bayo, and welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hello, my dear sister. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well this morning. How are you?
I'm great.
Good. I'm so excited for this conversation. I've been looking over content and your work that you've put out into the interwebs, and I have so many questions, and I'm really looking forward to just having this conversation and hearing what your heart has to say today. So what we usually start these interviews out with is by asking, what would you like interviews to get out of our interview today?
A sense of disorientation, I reckon. There's a saying among my people, and I don't mean to romanticize my people. We're all figuring this out together. But there's a proverb, and it says that in order to find your way, you must become lost. So there is a sense of disorientation that precedes, and not in a linear fashion, but you might say invites a different way of being in the world, or that births transformation. So maybe what we need at this time in our moment of civilization is to lose our way generously.
It's beautiful.
I hope that's what they get from this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm excited to dig into that a little bit and hear more of what that means for you. So I wondered if we could start with you just telling us about the work that you're doing and kind of what your focus is right now.
Yeah, it's really hard to characterize. I've often dabbled in rituals to identify my work or what I feel called to do, what surprisingly people feel attracted to. I can't quite nail it, put my finger on it. Why is there a groundswell of attention to not just the things I'm saying, but the concepts and the invitation that is present here that resists being owned by one person or something? What's happening here? I was trained as a clinical psychologist, taught in a university in Nigeria, where I did my Ph.D. learning with Yoruba healers called Babalawos, their own nosology and ways of identifying illness or disorder. They, of course, did not depend on the DSM, any iteration. They had other techniques, other ways of knowing and being in the world. And I wanted to really, as a way of decolonizing, not returning to an original path, but to touch the things that were seemingly lost but still lingering and haunting. I wanted to touch those bodies, those flows, those ideas. And they kind of introduced me to this idea of lostness and transformation, and even possibly the haunting and conspiratorial suggestion that trauma is a portal to other realms if you will. And so I kind of pride myself when my wife isn't rolling her eyes as I talk to people. I pride myself in being a trans public intellectual. Not a public intellectual in the Socratic tradition, but a trans public intellectual being the one poised or part of a collective poised at the edges of the familiar, wanting a different kind of a public to materialize because the public we inhabit is haunted and is probably toxically closed. So my work, so to speak, and I hesitate to even call it my work, is listening, is standing at the crossroads.
I really appreciate that. And for me, what most lands is that last bit that you shared of the work is really listening. I think so many of us right now, that's a huge part of my work right now, is really listening so that I can understand better. Can you share with us a little bit about, you talk about being on the edges of the familiar and that there's this haunting. Can you say more about that, the haunting nature of what's happening right now?
Yeah. Well, I've often also described myself as a recovering psychologist. It's quite more than often, actually. I introduce myself as a recovering psychologist. And the idea is not to relegate, dismiss, disparage what we as decolonial artists have learned to name as Western psychotherapy in order to delineate, to notice and signify or mark the places where cross-cultural dynamics want to be noticed, and to resist the idea that there is a universal self or a universal modality of meeting and encountering selves and bodies and individuals. So I describe myself with some comedic glint in my eye as a recovering psychologist, but at some serious level, I mean to also highlight the ways that I was trained in Western paradigms. And I know that to speak about the Western might suggest that I think in terms of binaries. I don't. I think it's a useful way to have a conversation about certain imperial and colonial dynamics that shape the ways that we govern or think about what it means to be human or to be selves or to be selfings. So I was trained in that modality. I was trained to sit on the couch or to invite people to sit on the couch to shrink stuff, you know. Of course, my modality or my practice wasn't psychodynamic, but more humanistic before I fell off the humanism bandwagon. And in my country, there's a struggle to attend to even notice mental struggles. We have only maybe 2-3 functioning hospitals for 200 million people. And so the federal government of Nigeria has, over time, struggled to cater to those needs. As I was articulating what I wanted to do for a doctorate degree, people pushed me to see ways to solve that. But I felt, what if the solution is part of the problem? Maybe there's another way of convening the clinical alliance. Maybe there's another way of thinking about health and well-being that is not available for institutional lexicons and ways of speaking. So what if we fell off that track? What if we failed? Hence, I went underground. These men were underground. Babalawos, they're priests, known across the Atlantic too, in Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian circles. And so they kind of materialized the meaning for me of leaning on the edges, of waiting for something else to happen that is not available in our modalities of healing, of signaling a different ethnography of becoming, of inviting me to notice that even well-being is political, no less ideological than the Bible itself. And so this is the invitation for me to study the intersections or intersections of politics and well-being and imperialism and history and spirituality and archetypes, James Hillman right there, and to see how these sprout new worlds.
I love what you've said here. There's so much there that there's a lot of layers that I would love to kind of tease out. But what if the solution is part of the problem?
I like layers.
And what if we fell off that track? What if we stepped away from that and explored a different way?
Yes.
So yeah, I'd love to hear what your explorations have brought about.
Yes. Yes.
I'm thinking about, some of your work that I've looked over, and I'm thinking about how is it that you're holding trauma, like that whole piece of the conversation, while you're exploring these other tracks?
Well, it's something those of us in the so-called global South have come to recognize as an intriguing characteristic of the global North, especially North America. It's the preponderance and the prevalence of the word or the term trigger, for instance, and the ubiquity of trauma as a way of making sense of suffering. And while I would never dismiss trauma as a way of understanding suffering, what we feel invited to do today is to reframe it, is to notice how it is imbricated with political arrangements that are tied with the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, that are tied with the legacies of extractivism, of computational capitalism, of the algorithms of suffering that we have today, so that sometimes it might be the case that healing or getting well, getting a clean bill of health from your doctor or your clinician could actually be part of the problem. And there is actually a term in medicine called iatrogenesis or iatrogenic, which marks the place where the healing becomes the wound. The medicine kind of doubles back on itself and starts to do shadowy things instead of what it's supposedly designed to do. So this is why I formulated this idea of postactivism, which is not some kind of superior argument about activism or an after activism, but a way of inviting us to sit with the question, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? So part of the things I'm really excited about doing today, in fact, I'm doing this right now with a dear brother of mine who teaches in the United States. I also teach in the United States. His name is Jürgen Kramer. He's a professor in the US and formulated this idea of ethno-autobiography. And we are writing right now about, among other things, reformulating trauma, thinking it through animist or post-humanist lenses instead of the humanist lenses that we are used to. And this is important because, and I think most readers of psychological research may not know this, but the history of trauma is imbricated with the emergence of industrialized society, specifically of the train tracks. The first terminology that emerged to mark the place of what we now know as trauma was railway spine by J. Erickson. And through the years, it became the psychosomatic phenomenon we know as trauma today. We're asking, what if trauma is more than an individual phenomenon? What if it's even more than a collective phenomenon? Just like psychologists are understanding today, suggesting that we may not need to tether trauma to experience, hence intergenerational trauma. Maybe experience is not central to it. What if we are being invited to notice land trauma, that the modern human world around us also is an archive of memory and feeling? What if we are participating in territories of feeling? Was it Teresa Brennan that writes about the transference of affect, the idea that emotions are not ours, they're not human individuals, they are flows and liminal becomings? What if trauma is part of material emergence in its geometries of care and harm? What if we're dealing with something that transcends modern, rationalistic, rectilinear circuits of being and becoming?
Well, can we follow that trail a little bit? I'd love to explore that. What if that is true? Then what do you see as being the next piece?
Oh, maybe I could enter this rhizome we're co-creating together by telling the story of the monk and his companion, another monk. So two monks walking down the river, and to their side the river, and not too long into their journey, their stroll, they hear this cry for help.
No.
And this person is screaming because the person is drowning. And one of the monks jumps in. Do you know the story, Emily?
No.
Oh,
No.
great. I love it when people don't know the story. One of the monks jumps in and drags the person out, right? And saves the person, resuscitates, and they continue on their journey. And not too long after that, another person is drowning. The same thing happens again. Monk, water, saving, out, and they continue that way. And it just goes on and on. They keep on hearing cries for help for people that are strangely drowning all of a sudden. Now, on the last person that cries out, this monk, instead of jumping into the water, just runs upstream. And his companion calls out to him and says, "Where are you going? You know I can't swim. Save this person," no matter how many times we're called to do this. and the racing companion calls back or says back that, well, I'm going to stop them from where they're falling in. It almost seems as if we are in a paradigm that is unable to address deeper flows, deeper spiritual and urgent imperatives, deeper ecological conditions that demand and sustain us and our becomings. So healing becomes this political resuscitation of the individual in its closure, in its cosmological quarantine away from things around us. One of the Babalawos that I spoke with, I raised a question during my interview because I don't speak my own language. This person was of my people, my tribe, but because I was well educated, you see, I don't speak my language. So I'm stuck in English. And I remember asking this fellow, I said, so what do you do with auditory hallucination? What's your approach? What do you do? Right? Because I'm only hearing you talk about plants. How do you heal that? And he said, why would you want to heal that? What if that's your grandmother reaching out to you? What if that's your uncle or your grandfather or someone speaking to you? What if you need to listen to that voice? This was the disorientation that broke the cyclicity of my expertise, that suggested that there are competing cosmologies that invite different notions of health and well-being. And I think in a time such as we are in, which geologists are proposing we call the Anthropocene, the age of man, which is characterized by our quest for transcendence and simultaneously our dismissal of our concatenation with ecology. I think in these times, we need other ways of ritualizing well-being. We need to take that idea and look at it again. This is not something we can do on our own. This is something we have to do together with the world, together with ancestrality, together within cybernetic flows, together with failure, so to speak.
I love that. This idea of we need to have a different notion of what health and well-being actually is. Because I know for me, I've got this idea of what well-being means for me. And so this idea of that, can I break away from that?
Yeah.
And like you said, what if we're supposed to listen to that?
Yeah.
What if what we think is the problem is actually a communication that we need to be listening to, which I suspect is that disorientation you were hoping for.
Kind of said something about it, yes. If we start to think of trauma as political, as gastronomical, microbial, ecological, archetypal, and not just situated as we're used to doing within individual experiences, then it becomes a crossroad. Yoruba have this idea of a crossroads, this place where monstrosity materializes. So this is something that I would like to say that connects our psychological conversations with history of slave trade, for instance. In a beautiful conversation with one of my dear sisters who teaches in California, Professor Marisol de la Cadena, we talked about how the capture of black bodies from Africa was more than just capturing humans. In fact, it was a capturing of bodies into the coloniality of being human. It was that they were stolen away from their animism and stuffed into these boxes, into a spectrum where they were not quite human, but on the way to being human. And this is a way of noticing the human as a colonial territory, right? Not just the anthropomorphic figures we're used to, not just the ways that our subjectivities are modulated or convened by city life and the everyday, but the vast territory of the ways we think about space-time, wellness, beginnings, middles, endings, relationships, how we treat the world around us, how we relegate that to resource, reenacting the architecture of the slave ship, resource, black bodies, surface, where white identified or Euro descendants dance upon. And this is not a guilt trip. This is an invitation to notice the boxes we occupy. And the way we frame trauma could actually be a cybernetic program to restore us into the continuity of this modern individualism. It's like we pathologize the edges that we're afraid of, the tentacular edges that we're afraid of. And we name the voices evil. Well, we don't name it evil, except you're thinking theologically, but we name it something pathological. We name it auditory hallucination. And then that Babalawo says, what if that's a grandmother? So you see, it's like there are competing realities here, and they're inviting us, especially when we're stuck, to lean into the cracks, the failures. And maybe, this is no guarantee, this is no promise of prophetic solutions, this is no prediction. This is maybe by performing your way through those cracks, you might find other ways of being in the world. Just like huitlacoche is, the Mexican delicacy, is summoned from a fungal pathogen. Maybe the sickness is a delicacy in the weight.
Wow. I love what you're saying, and I'm trying to pull those ideas and like somehow how do they intersect with what I have sensed to be true for myself in my own life. And I'm thinking of this piece of that you're saying of like, because what feels true to me is that, you know, when I think of trauma, I think of that as happening inside of me. It's not like an event, right? And we've heard that taught before. And so my brain is maybe trying to create some new pathways. Okay, so what does that mean then? The trauma is actually what's leading us in a new direction of where we need to go.
Yes, let me put it this way. I'll respond in, with two voices, with two tongues. One is to hold with tension this idea of the inside. Of course, it's not just me. I learned from multiple others that have been saying over time, especially feminist writers, that the inside is not quite as interior as we think it is. It is exposed. Stacey Alimo, that's a book, Exposed, right? Karen Barad, Vicky Kirby, Donna Haraway. They invite us to notice that we are not as closed off as we think we are. That selfing, and I say selfing, right? I put a gerund to the self, is a continuous navigation, a continuous propitiatory or way of being in the world. We navigate these things. We're not coherent or prior to these relationships. And to maybe exemplify that, you might read about neuroparasitology. I don't know, I've been playing with this idea for some time with people. You've heard of that field, right?
I mean, I know nothing of it, so I'm writing it down. I can do a little research.
I know next to nothing, but neuroparasitology is about the ways these critters actually influence behavior, human behavior, potentially driving us to do things that we, in retrospect, record as an inside, a gilded interiority, whereas we're dealing with vast territories that disturb the binary of inside versus outside. One example, and this is not about humans, I can't remember the human examples, but one of my favorite examples is the sporulation of Pheocodiceps unilateralis, which is this fungal bean that spills its guts and part of its spores attaches itself to ants. There was a beautiful documentary on this. You might have watched it. Many people did. And it inseminates the boundaries between the inside and the outside and the inside of the ant's head and does wonders there. The infected ant, first of all, fails to be called by the other ants, leaves the ant colony and dies on a stalk, bites into the leaf, and then something grows out of its head. It's very Lovecraftian. It's very horror. And this idea that we are oriented, swayed, moved, instigated, appellated by things beyond our liberal humanist selves is very, very hard to take in. But that's the speculative fabulation we're playing with here. That's the idea that the inside is not as inside. And then the second part is that none of this discountenances or dismisses your experience. What I'm saying is, as I like to tell people, is not the truth. I'm done with that idea of a Newtonian Cartesian ideal that is universal. I'm more likely to see what we rudely call reality as divergent and convergent, never congealing into the one thing. Too promiscuous for that kind of move. And the things I'm saying could not even be applicable to you in your context, in your journeys. But where I speak from, as a child of the global south who is witnessing the demise of civilization, so to speak, I feel it would be rude of us not to connect health and the ways we think about trauma to the crisis we're facing, even to climate chaos, even to the Anthropocene, even to the loss of bodies.
Okay, I'm trying to pull in what I'm hearing. I'm probably going to need to listen back on this interview several times. What is coming up for me right now is just kind of a noticing of how individualistic I was approaching that idea of trauma. Like, this is how I experienced it. It's inside of my body.
Yeah.
What I'm really hearing you say is there's like a truth out there.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of taking this in of like, okay, Emily, you've really been thinking about trauma in a very individualistic way. And there's kind of another framework available here. Like you said, it's not even just collective. It's like beyond the collective.
It's beyond the collective. It's liminal. It's like a murmuration of birds. Have you seen a murmuration of starlings? It's not an individual thing, and it's not even a collective. There's a dynamic that exceeds just throwing birds together into the sky. There's something quantum, if you will. There's something else there.
So that's kind of the flavor that I'm getting of your work. I think that might be what I was drawn to, at least when I was looking over it. I'm like, there's something else here that I have not integrated. Like even right now, my brain feels kind of foggy as I'm just trying to think of these concepts and pull it in and like, how can I meet that? So what next? What direction do you want to take this? Because I'm like, help me see what's next.
Let me put it this way, in terms of something that might be practically available for our consumption.
Yeah.
What we're doing here is that we are reframing the wound. In some sense, Freud was onto something when he spoke about the unspeakability of trauma.
Yeah.
But I think it's not available to wakeful consciousness. So the work of therapy is to, of course, in that regard, to resurface it through abreactional processes. But the issue here is the politics of naming those boundaries, and to think of the not yet legible as the non-existential is to rule out too strictly possible influences, the unthought, the unsaid, and how they influence and actually make room for our being. But let me turn it down a notch from the ethereal to the more practical, I guess. We are in a pandemic right now, and the wound has been framed in many ways. This is a terrible situation. Millions have been affected, and we are in a terrible moment in modern history. So there's this wound perched in the sky that has torn our expectation of the future, what it means to be in the city, what it means to be in public, how we meet and touch and greet others, just shaped everything. And what it has also done is that it has sprouted new ethnographies of movement, new ethnographies of healing. And I mean it in this sense. Out of the wound, as I like to say, is sprouts new engagements. If I ask you a question now, when you have toothache, where do you go?
I go to the dentist.
Exactly. You don't go to your pastor. You don't go to the babalawo. You don't go to a tree. You go to the dentist. And if you found out, and I hope this is not the case for you, if you found out you had COVID, where would you go? If you just did a test at home, what's the first thing you do?
I went to the doctor. That's what I did.
You go to the doctor, right?
Yep.
So you don't go to a tree, you don't go to an altar.
Right.
That's one ethnography. It's like the series of relationships, the reticulated network of relationships that sprout from an event such as a pandemic, such as a wound, a traumatic bursting through of possibilities. One of those ethnographies is restorative. Is the attempt to contain this burst and to restore a sense of the familiar. Hence, America's political language of getting back to normal, build back better. It's about let's restore what we know. And whatever you think about vaccinations, whether you're pro-vax or anti-vax, that's not my problem right now. Vaccinations could enact a form of returning. It's like, let's vaccinate ourselves so we can return to what we know, what we know how to do, how we know how to shop, how we know how to meet others, so we can be free. So there's something restorative. There's something that is tied up with notions of justice, restoring the image of ourselves, of the individual, that is tied to one ethnography that sprouts from the wound. But there's another one. The other one is monstrous and transmutational. It's when disability is so severe that it cannot close so easily, and it forces us sometimes to go out of the ways that we're used to. It forces us away from the algorithm. So it's what some people here in India did, because maybe they did not have access to vaccines. They went and built altars. Science might look upon that and say that is rubbish. This is terrible, primitive behavior. You ought to go to get your vaccine or to your doctor. But that presumes that reality is single, that even a virus is a single thing, a molecular entity that can be studied, and not just an assemblage of relationships. That presumes that things are neat and tidy and convenient instead of network-like. And so a different ethnography is what I'm talking about. The ways that our institutions and systems and algorithms teach us about healing is to return us to what we know. And these epistemological, ethical, moral things that we know are politically allied with larger territories. And so to be well is to be divorced from you, Emily, is to be divorced from ecology. To be well means I am disconnected from other voices. To be well means I can continue with my work of blasting open mountains and spilling oil into the seas. Let's get back to normal. But the other notion of trauma, and I'm reclaiming trauma from its modern notions tied to the politics of empire. The other notion is to make sanctuary, to make space for the monstrous, to invite community to surround mutation, and to see where that takes us. And I've seen this play out in terms of a psychotherapeutic politics that invites, instead of healing them, right? And I use healing in a very specific sense here. I don't want to disparage it. It works for many people. Instead of healing, we're doing something else. We're shape-shifting. And then something new is born.
That's a beautiful invitation. Forgive me, I'm feeling a little emotional because it feels so true. What I'm hearing you say is this invitation that there's another way through this.
Yeah.
It feels really important.
Yeah.
As you've kind of been working through this process, and I see that it's really vast, like the territory that you're exploring, like there's so much there. I'm curious if there's anything specific that you've learned in your process that's really helped you in your work.
I'm learning to surrender a little bit of my sanity at the feet of the crack, at the feet of the dishuman, of the disabled. There's something ontological about this dimension or notion of decoloniality and emancipation that I speak of, which is not a flight to heaven, but a performance of a different kind of embodied being on the planet or with the planet. My son is 4 years old. His name is Kea. In a way of speaking, he's on the autistic spectrum. This is devastating to us when we came to know this. This is something I've often confessed, that in spite of my theoretical orientations, I felt really drawn to fixing him. My public-facing self was inviting people to stay with the trouble, but behind the scenes, I really was battling with wanting to restore a sense of normalcy because I felt a deep sense of grief and loss that this thing has taken away my son from me and denied me the joys of playing ball with my son or catch or riding bikes. And so it was always studying and looking for different ways of fixing him, even when I told myself I didn't want to. But thank goodness for my wife. She's the one you should be having a conversation with. She's a lot more grounded and situated than I will ever be. And one day, while Kea was, in a manner of speaking, throwing a tantrum, lying down on the floor and just screaming for something that was not discernible to me, just fugitive. I could not think about what in the gesture that had just preceded his rupture could have instigated that behavior, and I was undone by it, and I was sitting down and I had tears. And I remember EJ saying to me, what if this is not a meltdown? Don't call it that. Don't call it a meltdown. What if we treated this as an altar, a place of worship? You know, there are many theories about autism, sensory overload. What if there is a sense in which this is vaguely, possibly even divine, deeply uncomfortable to our sanities because we proceed in the world in particular ways? But what if we're losing or missing out on something by persisting in these ways? What if we stayed with this, as difficult as it could be? What if I supported you to do that and you support me to do that? And it's our journey. It's not his autism. It's an algorithm that implicates even our compulsory ableisms and the ways we insist on a surface, on a way of being well. And ever since that day, I've been trying to follow my son, to see him as a teacher, to meet him halfway, to use the words of Karen Barad, meeting the universe halfway, right? It's like to negotiate becoming an embodiment with him so that I am a little bit distrustful of my claims to sanity and arrival, because sanity and arrival took black bodies on slave ships. Sanity and arrival gave us the atomic bomb. Sanity and arrival is persisting in the proliferation of toxic materials, even when we have all the available data, at least within that epistemology, that way of knowing, that would tell us that we are in deep trouble, then what good is sanity? So my son is a crack. He's an event. And for me, that is staying with that trouble, with this pulsing, energetic intensity, is changing us, is changing me, and the things that I'm suddenly aware of. And that is the ethnography I speak of. It's like, instead of a fellowship of the ring, to use Tolkien's, we have a fellowship of the crack. Oh, I should write that down. A fellowship of the crack, and we surround the crack like a classroom, and we're intimately communing with this monstrosity. None of this is a guarantee that Kea would someday do something important in the ways we think about significance, but it does suggest that maybe that's not what's at stake. What's at stake is a glimpse of the impossible, and sanity is an incarceration. It does not allow us to glimpse the impossible, except that which we already know.
This reminds me of something that I read somewhere in your work. I don't remember where I read it, but this idea that the whole journey is the destination, and that each point is as noble as the final dot.
Yeah.
That it's really the journey, as we're surrounding the crack, as we're learning, that's so important. It's not this so-called destination that we think we need to reach.
Yes. It's the ongoing changing. It's the losing our way. It's the negotiating edges, because that's what we're always doing. Sanity is a place-making ritual. It's how we make place. It's how we situate the world. It's how we engage in anticipatory networks of movement. It's how we see the future and see the past. So it's not just a thing, it's a relationship. It's just as fragile as the things that we supposedly call or name as pathological. And I feel this ongoingness is what might save us. This idea of a relational, processual universe that is kind to even the enemy.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, as I've been listening to you, I'm feeling it from here, from my heart. It's like there's another way to take in all of this information, and it's landing. I don't think it's up in my head yet, but I'm like feeling it, how important that is. And I'm like okay with it in this moment, that it's the journey. I don't have to know yet what it means, or like what it means for me in my life.
Nice.
Or how I need to engage with it in the future. I'm just trying to stay with it in the moment right now as I'm feeling it in my heart.
Nice.
But this piece that it's the journey, and that it's being okay with kind of the messy middle place.
Oh, yes.
That I feel like we're all in.
Yes.
No one has any super solid answers about what life is going to look like even in a year, but being okay with what this messy middle can feel like and what it looks like in our lives feels really important to me.
The sermon of modern liberalism is that we are quarantined between our birth and our death. And that's all the self is, this longevity, this durational quality. But even trauma disturbs that, doesn't it? Even conventional notions of trauma. The unspeakable lingers. That which is supposedly done with and past still haunts and disturbs and quakes. And then we break up into a sweat. And then the intergenerational quality, the things that are supposedly done with in the way past time, is still resonant today. I think our lives exceed their boundaries, and this is not something that's easy to conceptualize. Language can only be poetic when it comes to meeting these edge realities, so to speak. We have to speak with a crooked tongue. You can't speak eloquently anymore. So there is a sense in which we're being invited to stay with this moment of poetic rupture.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. And kind of as we're starting to wrap up our time, I'm just, again, taking in kind of what's coming up for me right now. And what feels really nice about this conversation is the spaciousness. I think sometimes when we can get in a conversation around trauma, there's the human tendency to spiritualize, or like, it'll be okay, or like, this is going to make you better, going through this hard time. And what I love about this conversation is kind of acknowledging that the trauma can change us.
Yeah.
And that's maybe what needs to happen, without this dismissive, it'll be fine kind of thing.
Yeah.
But being in the journey, how beautiful that is.
I have no message of optimism. I even sometimes associate hope with the colonial project. There isn't a thing out there called hope, just like there isn't a thing, with due respect to Martin Luther King, called justice, to which the moral arc of the universe bends. I don't think in terms of ideas and categories. This is deconstructionism, Derrida. Yeah. So we perform hope. Hope is secreted in our territories, and in a sense, It's beautiful to never, ever, 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 ever give up, like Winston Churchill would advise us. But there's also sometimes when persistence and resilience starts to eat up itself, starts to cannibalize itself, when just doing it actually gets in the way of transformation. So I wonder if those dark places, even the places of hopelessness, are not invitations to create together, that the times we fall off axis are also generative. Maybe that's why psychologists are beginning to champion post-traumatic growth, finding language for that. And maybe I'll end this way about, especially that last point, that our histories, what Achille Mbembe might call black reason, convened across 3 phases, especially beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, that our history is replete with stories of abandonment and extractivism and displacement, and yet something queer, something unexpected sprouts in that place of thick darkness. One of the stories usually told, it seems apocryphal, but it's no less a powerful indicator of the things that decoloniality is all about. One of those stories is about a woman on a slave ship with her child, and the child is crying. As the child screams, the mother, unable to pacify the child, tears her dress and weaves out of the fabric a rag doll. And that rag doll is, at least for that moment, a temporary slice of infinity. A lyric in that soundtrack of capture is able to pacify this child. And in doing so, she names the rag doll Abayomi, and this catches on. Abayomi literally means, the full name is Otaobayomi Olorun Oje, but we shorten it for conversation into Abayomi. And what that means is a Yoruba name that is now in Brazil as a symbol of decoloniality. What that name means is, they thought they had buried me, but they did not realize I'm a seed. What it means is that the enemy thought he had killed me, but God was on my side. Right? God did not allow it. Olorun Oje, God did not allow it. And I keep on going back to that concept of Abayomi to rekindle this idea that even the shadows are amniotic with promise. And it's easy to do that because my son's name is also Abayomi and my father's name is Abayomi. So I'm caught in the messy middle of that decolonial journey.
That's a beautiful way to finish. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. If you're a licensed mental health practitioner, we invite you to join us for either of these Level 2 NARM therapist trainings beginning later this spring. In this training, you will learn a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from this team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers. For more information about both upcoming trainings, please visit narmtraining.com/level2. That's narmtraining.com/level2. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.